Daniel Hart never expected his night to fall apart so quickly, and as he drove through the freezing Vermont rain with his hands gripping the steering wheel, he kept replaying the argument with his wife, Emily, like a broken tape he couldn't shut off. The angry words between them felt too heavy, too sharp, and he didn't even remember how such a small misunderstanding had erupted into such a painful fight, only that he had stormed out before he said something he would regret, promising himself he would cool off before returning home. But the storm outside was far worse than he expected. Icy roads, fog, and a heater that barely worked, forcing him to pull over again and again just to steady his breathing, until finally he realized he couldn't make it home safely and needed a place to stay. And the closest place happened to be the small wooden cabin that belonged to his mother-in-law, Margaret, a woman who had always seemed to understand him even when he didn't deserve it. So he drove there, with a mix of shame and desperation, hoping she wouldn't ask too many questions. When he reached the cabin, rain pouring down his coat, he hesitated on the porch, feeling like a runaway husband who had no right to show up unannounced. But before he could turn back, the door opened and Margaret appeared with that gentle, steady presence she carried everywhere, her short silver hair tucked behind her ears, her eyes widening in worry when she saw his soaked clothes and pale face, and she immediately pulled him inside, saying nothing at first except, "You're freezing," while guiding him closer to the fireplace. The warmth hit him like a wave, and only then did he feel how cold he truly was. Trying not to break down in front of her, he explained in broken sentences that things with Emily had gotten rough, that the storm trapped him on the road, that he just needed a safe place for the night, and Margaret listened quietly, her face softening with sympathy, not pity, which Daniel would have hated, but genuine care, and she simply placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You did the right thing coming here. Tonight you rest." He nodded, grateful, and for a moment the crackling fire and the soft smell of lavender gave him a peace he hadn't felt in months. But that peace didn't last because when Margaret went to prepare the guest room, she returned wearing an apologetic frown, explaining that the room was under renovation and the couch he usually slept on had broken the week before. The wooden frame snapped beyond repair, and in this small cabin there weren't any other sleeping options. Before he could insist he would make do on the floor, Margaret crossed her arms and shook her head in that firm, nearly stubborn way she had, telling him there was ice on the roads, his car was barely holding together, and he was not allowed to leave, nor was he allowed to sleep on the floor like someone who didn't deserve comfort. So the only option left was for him to sleep in her room, which had a bed large enough to share without invading each other's space. Daniel froze at her words, not because the idea was strange, but because everything about the night already felt overwhelming, and now this unexpected arrangement pushed him even further into discomfort. But Margaret remained calm, almost amused at his panic, telling him there was nothing scandalous or uncomfortable about two adults sharing a bed in an emergency, especially when one of them was practically family, and she added with a small smile, "You're like a son to me, and I'm not letting you sleep cold when there's a warm bed right here." Her confidence left him with no room to argue, and she was right. The storm outside was getting worse, the rain slamming against the windows, the wind carrying the kind of chill that froze everything it touched. So he sighed and nodded, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and gratitude as she led him toward her room, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath their footsteps. The room was warm, cozy, lit only by a small lamp on the nightstand and filled with the gentle scent of lavender she always used on her pillows. Daniel felt awkward standing near the bed, not knowing where to put his hands or how to breathe normally, but Margaret acted as if it were the most ordinary situation in the world, pulling back the blanket and telling him to get comfortable while she fetched extra pillows to create space between them. He sat on the edge of the mattress, still tense, still thinking about Emily, still wishing the night had turned out differently, yet at the same time he couldn't deny how exhausted he was, the kind of exhaustion that seeped into his bones. And when Margaret returned, she noticed the heavy look in his eyes and said in a quiet voice, "You look like you're carrying too much for one person." And Daniel nearly broke at the softness of that sentence, but he didn't respond because he didn't know how. Without unraveling completely. Instead they settled under the blankets, the room quiet except for the distant rumble of thunder and the soft hum of the heater, and though there was nothing romantic or inappropriate about the arrangement, there was an undeniable intimacy in the simple human closeness. Two people lying in the same space, sharing the same warmth, breathing the same air, one hurting, one offering comfort without asking for anything in return. Daniel stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of his mistakes, the fear that he had pushed Emily too far, the worry that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside him. And just when he felt the room settle into silence, Margaret spoke again, her voice gentle but steady, saying, "Daniel, there's something I think you should know about Emily." And those words cut through the quiet like lightning, making his eyes snap open and his heart pound, because the tone in Margaret's voice wasn't casual. It carried something deeper, something serious, something that felt like the beginning of a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. Daniel lay stiffly on the left side of the bed, staring at the ceiling while the storm outside rattled the cabin windows, and even though the room was warm and the blankets soft, his heart felt tight with worry, guilt, and a strange sense of vulnerability he hadn't felt in years. Beside him, Margaret adjusted her pillows calmly, not bothered at all by the unusual arrangement, and after a few quiet moments she turned slightly toward him and said in a gentle voice, "Daniel, you're breathing like someone who's carrying something heavy. Talk to me." And even though he wanted to pretend he was fine, her tone, steady, motherly, stubborn, made it impossible to hide anything. He tried to brush it off, muttering that it wasn't important, but Margaret simply waited, as patient as someone who had spent years helping people open up, and eventually Daniel exhaled a shaky breath and admitted the truth, that he and Emily had been drifting apart for months, that he felt like he was losing her day by day, and that tonight's argument had pushed him closer to despair than he wanted to admit. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression calm but deeply sympathetic, and when he finished speaking, she placed a warm hand on his arm, not in a romantic way, but in the comforting way a caring older woman reaches out when she sees someone breaking, and she said softly, "You two are not losing each other, you're just losing your way." Words that hit Daniel harder than he expected because they felt honest rather than comforting. The room felt smaller in that moment, the storm quieter, as if even the world was listening. He rubbed his face with both hands, telling her he didn't know how to fix anything anymore. That every conversation with Emily felt tense, rushed, filled with misunderstandings, and it scared him because he loved his wife more than anything but didn't know how to reach her. Margaret nodded slowly and told him something he had never considered. That love could become quiet, not because it's fading but because life gets loud, and if two people forget to pause and truly look at each other, even the strongest bond can feel fragile. Her words were simple, but they settled deep into him like seeds of truth he hadn't been ready to face until now. The silence between them changed, warming, softening, and Daniel felt a strange comfort in being next to someone who wasn't judging him, wasn't blaming him, wasn't telling him he had failed, but simply reminding him that relationships were built on courage, not perfection. Margaret stretched slightly, adjusting the blanket, and told him to lie down properly because he looked like a soldier ready to march out of bed, and he managed a weak laugh because she was right. He was rigid as a board, but eventually he settled deeper into the mattress, though his mind was still racing. The firelight flickered through the crack of the half-open door, casting warm shadows across the room, and for the first time since the argument, Daniel's heartbeat slowed enough for him to breathe normally. Margaret sensed the shift and gently encouraged him to say more if he needed to, reminding him that talking doesn't make a man weaker, it makes him real, and he found himself confessing the fears he hadn't dared to speak aloud to anyone else, that Emily sometimes pulled away emotionally, that he wasn't sure if she still saw him as the man she wanted to spend her life with, that every small disagreement felt like a sign of something bigger, and that tonight he had left the house not because he wanted distance but because he was terrified of saying something that would hurt them both. Hearing all this, Margaret didn't rush to offer solutions. Instead, she said something that stunned him with its depth. "Daniel, being scared doesn't mean you're wrong for each other. It means you still care enough to be hurt." He blinked, absorbing those words, and even though he wanted to believe them, doubt still lingered. Sensing this, Margaret spoke again, her voice gentle but firm, saying that Emily had been struggling too, that she had confided things to her mother recently, things Daniel hadn't known about, and his heart sharpened with curiosity and worry, prompting him to ask what Emily had said. But Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned on her side, facing him fully now, her expression thoughtful, as if deciding how much to reveal. She told him that Emily wasn't pulling away because she stopped loving him. She was pulling away because she felt she wasn't enough, that she couldn't meet his expectations, that she feared disappointing him more than losing an argument with him. Those words hit Daniel like a tidal wave, unexpected and overwhelming, because he had always assumed he was the one failing her, not the other way around, and he suddenly realized how much fear both of them carried without ever speaking it. For a long moment he didn't say anything. He just stared at the ceiling again, trying to piece together the new picture forming in his head. A marriage not breaking but quietly calling for help. Margaret watched him with soft eyes, telling him gently that love required honesty, even when honesty felt fragile, and Daniel nodded slowly, finally understanding that the distance between him and Emily wasn't made of anger or resentment. It was made of silence. The bed felt warmer now, the storm outside less threatening, but before he could process everything fully, Margaret shifted slightly, her voice dropping to a serious tone he hadn't heard from her before, and she said, "Daniel, there's something else you need to know about Emily, something she asked me not to tell you unless the time was right." And Daniel's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding because the way Margaret said it didn't sound simple. It sounded important, heavy, something that could change everything. He turned to look at her, the lamplight catching the worry on her face, and before he could ask what she meant, a sudden sound echoed faintly through the cabin, a soft but distinct knock at the front door, breaking the moment like a burst of cold air. Daniel and Margaret looked at each other, startled, and Margaret whispered, "Who would come here this late?" But before she could stand, the knock came again, gentle, hesitant, but unmistakably familiar, and Daniel felt his pulse spike as a single thought flashed through him: Emily. And as Margaret climbed out of bed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she looked at him with wide eyes and said, almost breathlessly, "Daniel, I think that's her." Daniel's heart pounded so hard he felt it in his throat as he followed Margaret toward the door, the sound of the soft knocks echoing through the quiet cabin like something pulled straight from a dream or a warning. And when Margaret finally opened the door, the cold night air rushed in, carrying rain, silence, and the trembling figure of Emily standing beneath the porch light with her hair soaked, her hands shaking, and her eyes raw from crying. The sight of her hit Daniel with a mix of shock, relief, guilt, and something deeper he hadn't felt in months. Emily stepped inside slowly, not looking at either of them at first, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to be there. And when her eyes finally lifted to his, something in Daniel's chest tightened painfully because she looked so small, so tired, so lost, and suddenly the argument between them felt meaningless compared to the heartbreak on her face. She apologized first, barely above a whisper, saying she didn't want them to end the night in anger, that she had been driving around trying to calm down, but the storm kept getting worse and fear took over. Fear of the roads, fear of what their marriage was turning into, fear of losing him because of misunderstandings that never should have grown this big. And Daniel felt every word like a soft punch, because he had been feeling the same fears but didn't know how to express them without sounding weak or unsure. He stepped closer, wanting to pull her into his arms but unsure if she would let him, and Emily looked around the cabin nervously. Then her gaze landed on the hallway behind them, the one that led to Margaret's bedroom, and she blinked in confusion, asking where he had been staying, and Margaret, always direct, told her calmly that the couch was broken, and that she had insisted Daniel share the bed because it was safer than letting him drive home in a storm. Emily nodded, but Daniel saw the flicker of insecurity in her expression. Not jealousy, just the fear that maybe she had pushed him away so far, he had no one to turn to except her mother, and he hated that thought. Before he could speak, Margaret gently excused herself to give them space, telling them she'd make tea and that they should talk, and as she stepped into the kitchen, Daniel and Emily were left standing in the warm glow of the fireplace, the sound of rain softening outside, the moment stretching heavy and fragile between them. Emily finally whispered that she never wanted things to get like this, that she missed the way they used to talk freely without worrying how the other would react, that she sometimes felt she wasn't enough for him, saying the exact words Margaret had shared earlier. And hearing them from Emily's own lips nearly broke Daniel because he finally understood how much pressure she carried alone. He reached for her hands, and this time she didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a soft breath, as if she had been waiting for him to make the first move, and he told her the truth he had been holding inside, that he felt like he was failing her, that he thought she was drifting away because she had lost interest, that he worried he wasn't giving her what she needed emotionally, and that the argument earlier wasn't about anger. It was about two people scared of the same thing but too afraid to say it. Emily's tears welled again, but this time they weren't from sadness, they were from relief, and she whispered that she hadn't been slipping away, she had simply been overwhelmed by work, life, expectations, and the fear that if she admitted how stressed she was, Daniel would see her as weak. Hearing that, he shook his head immediately, telling her he never wanted her to carry anything alone, that he wanted to be her safe place, not the person she was scared to disappoint. As the fire crackled softly behind them, the tension that had been building for months slowly unraveled, replaced by a quiet honesty that neither had allowed themselves to feel in a long time. Margaret returned with tea, observing them with a soft, hopeful smile, and she gently reminded Emily that love isn't lost just because life gets noisy. Sometimes people simply forget to listen. Emily sat beside Daniel near the fire, curling her fingers around the warm mug, and she confessed something she hadn't told either of them. She had gone to therapy secretly for the past few months, trying to deal with her stress before involving Daniel, but instead of helping, it made her feel even more guilty because she thought she was hiding something from him, and the shame of that had pushed her further into silence. Daniel wasn't angry. Instead, he felt proud of her for trying so hard, even if she had felt alone in the process, and he told her that next time they would face things together, not separately. Margaret listened quietly, nodding in approval, and then she revealed the thing she had meant to tell Daniel earlier. That Emily had been asking her for advice about how to reconnect with him, how to bring back the warmth they once had, and how to navigate her fear without making things worse. Proof that Emily never stopped loving him, not for a second. The truth softened everything between them, and Daniel felt something inside him shift. A warm, gentle certainty that their marriage wasn't breaking. It was simply waiting to be rebuilt with honesty instead of fear. Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, something she hadn't done in weeks, and whispered that she had driven through the storm because she couldn't stand the idea of him spending the night feeling unwanted or alone. And Daniel wrapped an arm around her, promising that no matter how rough things got, they would always find their way back to each other. Margaret smiled at them in that motherly, proud way she had, then excused herself again, saying she would finish preparing the guest room even if it wasn't ready, because now that Emily was here, things were different, lighter, hopeful, and Daniel and Emily exchanged a warm, tired laugh. They sat together in front of the fire for a long time, talking about their fears, their dreams, the pressures they had both been carrying, and slowly the storm outside faded from thunder to a light drizzle, as if the night itself had softened. They didn't fix everything in one conversation, but they started somewhere real, somewhere honest, somewhere more important than perfection. And as the cabin settled into a peaceful quiet, Daniel realized that the truth Margaret shared, and the bravery Emily showed by coming here, had changed everything, not with dramatic gestures but with simple, raw honesty that reminded him why he fell in love with her in the first place. The storm had almost passed by the time dawn touched the edges of the sky, and inside the cabin Daniel woke before anyone else, lying on the sofa in the living room because Margaret had refused to let them share a bed while emotions were still raw. But even from there he could hear the soft breaths of Emily sleeping nearby, curled beneath a warm blanket Margaret had carefully tucked around her at midnight, and for a moment he simply watched her, remembering every little thing he had taken for granted. The way her hair fell across her cheek, the way she curled her fingers when she slept, the quiet strength she carried even when she didn't feel strong, and he realized, with a heaviness mixed with hope, that love wasn't always loud, sometimes it was quiet like this, simple and waiting to be noticed again. He stood slowly and stepped outside for air, feeling the damp earth beneath his feet and breathing in the scent of pine and wet soil. The world felt new, like someone had washed away the night's weight with the rain, and he found himself wishing that healing relationships were as simple as storms clearing on their own. But then he heard the cabin door open and Emily stepped out wearing one of Margaret's sweaters, her eyes sleepy but warm, and she walked to him without hesitation, slipping her hand into his like she used to when they first fell in love. The moment was small but powerful, and Daniel felt something settle inside him, something that said they could start again, not from scratch but from honesty. Emily said she didn't sleep much, that her mind kept replaying everything Daniel had told her the night before, all the fears they had both been hiding, and she admitted that part of her wanted to run from those feelings, but a stronger part wanted to face them with him because she didn't want fear to shape their marriage anymore. Daniel squeezed her hand gently, telling her he didn't expect perfection, just openness, because silence had done more damage than any argument ever could. They talked as the sky brightened, walking slowly along the gravel path behind the cabin, where puddles mirrored the faint orange glow of sunrise. Emily confessed that she had been scared of asking for help, scared of needing too much, scared that turning to Daniel would make him think she wasn't strong enough, and hearing this, Daniel felt a sting in his chest because he realized how often he had encouraged her to be fine, instead of really asking if she was okay. He apologized, not dramatically but sincerely, and told her he wanted to create a space where they could be flawed together, where they didn't need to hide stress or sadness or doubt. Emily's eyes softened and she whispered that she loved him, not just in the easy moments but in the hard ones too, and that she was tired of pretending everything was perfect when what she really needed was connection. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, and Margaret was already awake, humming softly in the kitchen while stirring something in a pot. When she saw them together, her shoulders relaxed with visible relief, and she greeted them with warm smiles and 2 steaming cups of coffee. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She simply observed them with the calm happiness of someone who had watched something broken start to mend. Over breakfast, the 3 of them talked lightly at first, about the weather, about the repairs needed on the cabin, about the broken couch Daniel had almost slept on, and the casual conversation helped ease any lingering tension. But eventually, Margaret turned serious in her gentle way, and told them that relationships survive storms when both people are willing to sit in the rain together instead of running in different directions. And her words hit both of them with quiet truth. Emily leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder, and he felt the simple warmth of that gesture sink deep into him. After breakfast, they helped Margaret clean the dishes, laughing at small things and moving in unspoken rhythm, a reminder of how natural they once were together. When it was finally time to leave, the sun was bright enough to warm the cabin steps, and Margaret hugged them both tightly. She told Emily she was proud of her, and told Daniel he was stronger than he thought, and her voice carried the kind of support that made them both tear up a little. As they reached the car, Emily paused and looked back at the cabin, then at Daniel, and she smiled. A soft, hopeful smile that reminded him of the early days of their marriage. She said she didn't want things to go back to how they were before. She wanted them to be better, more honest, more connected, more real, and Daniel felt something bloom in his chest because he wanted the same thing, more than anything. On the drive home, they talked the entire time about their fears, their hopes, the small ways they could support each other, the things they had forgotten to express, and the things they didn't realize mattered so much. And by the time they reached their driveway, the weight between them had shifted into something lighter, something manageable. Before they stepped inside, Emily took his hand and said that she was ready to rebuild, step by step, and Daniel promised that no matter what storms came next, they would face them together instead of alone. And as they walked into their house, sunlight drifting across the walls, Daniel felt a quiet certainty settle in his heart. Love doesn't disappear when things get hard. It bends, trembles, stretches, and then, if both people choose it, finds its way back home with more strength than before.